Hey, everybody out there with us once again is AP journalist Bryant Thomas, lately of the AP News Bureau in Washington, D.C., a longtime political reporter and commentator. And today's big topic is Elon Musk. Apparently, he's the devil incarnate. He's going to be banned on both sides of the Atlantic. What he's doing, he's striking down journalists, blah, 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 all propaganda and hypocrisy. Brian, I know that you have a different viewpoint on that.
Well, yeah, I think he first of all has got a suspect motive here only because of the fact that he instantly restored Trump's Twitter account almost instantly when he took over at Twitter. And I think anybody who aligns himself with Trump's version of free speech has got to be suspect right off the bat.
He said he said you could criticize, Elon Musk said in taking down these reporters, he said you could criticize me all you want. That's not a problem. But don't dox my family, giving my and my family's exact location, which led to him taking down these so-called journalists. They were doxing him instead of doing actual reporting. That was a danger to him. I think it's a legitimate reason. But I'm reading a CNN Business Report, extensive article. You have to read through 10 minutes of it before they mention that the reason was doxing. But they're, heaping all this condemnation on the same reporters that didn't do anything with the Hunter Biden laptop story, with a lot of the other stuff that went by the boards that should have been reported to the public. Now they're holier than thou. I mean, the hypocrisy stinks to high heaven. These same journalists, nothing about the Hunter Biden laptop story and how it implicated Joe Biden. Nothing about doctors dissenting from the official COVID narrative. Nothing about the origins of COVID-19. Nothing about banning Trump. Nothing about even banning satire, which they've done, including one of my own satires. Taking orders from the FBI and the White House. That's already established. Twitter was doing that before Musk took over. The FBI, the White House, and other government agencies and figures were telling them what to ban, what to suppress, what to shadow ban, what to play down. And that's a violation of the First Amendment by proxy. The U.S. government, by proxy, was impinging free speech. On and on. So, and now all of a sudden, Musk is the bad guy?
Well, I think anybody who steps into the limelight the way Musk did with some of his public antics, not just with Twitter, but with with Tesla and all the other things that he has been engaged with publicly, and an erratic personality at times, is automatically suspect. I think that's a given.
Well, what do you mean automatically suspect of what?
Of having an ulterior motive, of having something to hide, something that is not being said or told to the American public.
Right. What's not being said and told is the context of this and the full story. He banned specifically 4 or 5 journalists who were doxing him. He hasn't banned any other journalists, any other citizen reporters, any other information on Twitter that criticizes him or criticizes politicians on either side of the aisle. He hasn't done that. Specifically, it was because of doxing, which I think is reasonable for him to be concerned about that.
One of the CNN reporters who was banned, and I can't think of his name, was on this morning and made mention of the fact that providing this type of information was probably a mistake. Probably a mistake. And I don't know whether he's saying that just to get back into Musk's good graces or whether he really believes it or whatever his motive is. All I'm saying to you is that when you have somebody like Musk or Trump, anybody with a strong personality, with strong views that often are controversial, this is not to be unexpected.
It's not to be unexpected, but it's not valid. That's the argument I'm trying to make. And I think I'm presenting it logically with real evidence. Naturally, somebody like that is exposed to all kinds of criticism, fair or unfair, true or false. That's not the issue here. The issue is the way they're distorting this reporting that he just banned these journalists because he doesn't like what they're saying. Had nothing to do with it. It was all about doxing. And they're not coming, Brian, we've both been journalists most of our adult lives. I mean, I don't know about you, but to me, the alarm bells are ringing loudly, deafeningly, of how information is being controlled more and more by the government and by their minions, including social media figures. And once the government controls access to information, controls the narrative, how is there a check and balance on the government, which the media is supposed to be? That's why we have the First Amendment. That's being put down the drain now. And it's being justified by people who call themselves journalists. The Washington Post, the New York Times, which were once supposedly crusading newspapers with Watergate, are now on board with all this propaganda. It's disgusting, and it's a real, valid threat to the First Amendment and democracy. Democracy cannot survive if the free flow of information is stopped.
And all of this started since Joe Biden took office.
It accelerated since Joe Biden took office, definitely. And you could tell by what's coming out now, where the FBI, the White House, they were in touch with them almost daily, several times a day in some instances, telling them what to be careful of, what not to print. You know, what they did, they were clever about how they weren't giving direct orders. But the FBI is calling you up and warning you that this is disinformation, blah, blah, blah. And don't forget, we have the regulators on our side. So naturally, the social media platforms are going to toe the line on this. I mean, this is government interference with the First Amendment. And that is a threat to this country, the freedom we've enjoyed all these years.
Well, let me go back 2 administrations and take you back to Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz and all that gang who gave us Abu Ghraib and Gitmo and waterboarding and all that stuff. Where was the outcry then?
At least in those, there was an outcry, and some of the journalists were putting that out, and they were not banned. Too many of the journalists had already become cheerleaders and propagandists, but not to this extent. But at least back then, you could get a contrary opinion and a report contradicting the official line. Now you can't get that increasingly. And that's the big difference. That's a big danger.
Well, I don't think it's as tight as you think it is. But, you know, that said, if you mentioned the Hunter Biden laptop, I think Junior will probably be charged with something. And if father is not a part of that, then that's the silver lining for the White House, because it will show that the Justice Department is indeed functioning and can function in a political atmosphere.
Disinformation, Brian. What's on that laptop is enough to charge him criminally. There's some of the child pornography on there, other things that he was doing, the smoking dope, crack, and this and that. That's enough to charge him criminally and perhaps jail him. Of course, that's not going to happen. But that's not the main concern of the content of that laptop, which was suppressed before the election because they didn't want anything to endanger Joe Biden getting elected. What's on that laptop shows that Joe Biden, as the sitting vice president of the United States, was making deals through his son, who was selling access to Joe as sitting vice president. And they were being paid by Burisma, by Russian figures, by Chinese figures, businessmen, oligarchs, and others. They were making money off of this. It's all on that laptop. Now, if you want to disprove that, at least investigate it. This FBI had that laptop before the election. They just sat on it all this time. They're still sitting on it. This is what's going on. That's the Justice Department?
Well, the Justice Department is indicating that Hunter Biden will likely, there's 2 sources that came out and said Hunter Biden will likely be charged. Now, here we go again with selective information being released. That's the same crap that Comey pulled about Hillary Clinton. You're not supposed to shoot your mouth off before somebody is indicted or arrested. It's that simple.
Do you realize what they're doing here? This is damage control. Indict the son. Some deal will be made behind the scenes. We won't even know when he waltzes out of whatever country club prison he may be going to for a while. The deal is damage control, focus on the son and not the old man. That is the real story here. How the vice president of the United States was gaining financially from deals with Ukraine, China, and Russia while he was sitting vice president. That's the story that they're trying to control. That's why they're throwing the son out now as a sacrifice to take the heat off the old man. And you know, and most probably, if he actually is jailed, he'll be out before long, out of public view. So this is a way to contain the story, take the focus off the president of the United States.
Well, you may have a point, you may not. It's certainly not public at this point, to the point where I would echo what you're saying about the president. I think his son is probably going to get nailed for something, whether it's Burisma or child pornography or drug use or whatever, remains to be seen. I just don't think that they've connected all the dots yet with Joe Biden.
Well, if you read what's on that laptop, there's plenty of dots.
We don't know what's on the laptop.
We do know what's on the laptop. It's been released. A lot of these emails. It's been out there for a year now, and more is coming out.
All of it? All of it?
A lot of enough to show how damaging this is already.
Well, that's my point. Somebody did a review of the laptop indicating that there were no changes made to the hard drive. Did you see that?
And what does that indicate?
Well, that indicates that whatever is on that laptop should be complete, should be completely released, and not cherry-picked just to bring about an end.
Oh, the only cherry picking going on now is with a couple of independent journalists who are going through it and releasing it more and more as they go along. They're not, in terms of whether they're holding back some stuff, I don't know. But don't forget, if that's the concern, how come the FBI hasn't acted on this? They had this laptop before the election, and they sat on this. No action at all because they were protecting Joe Biden. The FBI and other government agencies and figures now have been politicized. Where does that leave us as a country with checks and balances? This is a serious matter.
Well, I don't doubt that it's serious. I don't know if it's as involved as you assert. I just don't. I'm not there yet. That's all.
But Brian, here's some indications for those who are not even following things closely. COVID-19 outbreak. Now, right from the beginning, we knew as a fact that the Wuhan lab was experimenting with that virus. And it was in proximity. It was only a few miles away from the supposed outbreak of COVID through a wet farm, or whatever they call it there in China, where live animals are being sold and all that. Now, in the old days, when journalists were actual journalists rather than propagandists and cheerleaders, they would have at least asked the question, well, is it possible, considering the fact that the lab was experimenting on that vaccine and was close to the supposed outbreak, that warrants an investigation into whether the lab was the source? But that was shut down. And anybody even suggesting that there should be a probe, it was a conspiracy theorist. I mean, this is how bought off and controlled the media is. And that, again, is a direct danger to our democracy, because when the government controls all the information, there's no checks and balances.
And who in China would do this investigation?
Excuse
me?
Come
on. Who in China would do this investigation?
We funded, Fauci funded that lab. We have no control over that, not even to probe that, not even to put pressure on China.
No, I don't believe that for 1 minute. I think
you don't believe
the Chinese, that we could have pressured China to do anything. This government in Beijing does what it wants, when it wants to, and how it wants to. We've seen that over the years.
Right. Look, the problem, the reason why there's no pressure being put on China is because Biden and other Democrats and Republicans are on the gravy train with China. That's why there's no pressure, and the country is being sold out because of that on both sides of the aisle. I mean, there's no way we could have probed if the Wuhan lab was the outbreak, or even mentioned it. There was no mention of that from any of these agencies that it was a possibility. Our CIA and other agencies had no power to investigate that? They didn't want to investigate it. And again, what real investigative reporter or just plain everyday journalist would not be curious whether it was possibly a leak from the lab, considering the proximity, considering the fact that they were experimenting with that COVID vaccine? But nobody had any curiosity about it. This is a state of the media today.
When the COVID-19 virus made its way from China to the rest of the world, that was bad enough. We didn't need to have chapter and verse on who might have pulled the stopper out of the test tube to let it go.
Really?
It was out there already. It was killing people left and right, and job one was to stop the spread of the virus.
Okay, but 3 years now down the road, there's still no effort to find out the origin, which could possibly prevent another such outbreak in the future. So there's no concern about that. It's not legitimate to try to find out, was it from the lab, and take steps to prevent another such leak in the future? That's not a legitimate pursuit?
It probably is, and I bet you the Chinese officials overseeing the Wuhan lab have taken every step in the world to make sure that doesn't happen.
That lab was not rated high in terms of containing spills, and yet Fauci was still funding research at that lab. This is how cockeyed and corrupt this whole operation is with our government and China. They're working hand in hand because they're making money. Nancy Pelosi and her husband.
Wait a minute. How did we make money from the Wuhan lab? How did that happen?
We are making money from China. The reason why it was at the Wuhan lab is because it was banned for research by labs in this country because of the danger of a release. So Fauci is allowed to fund a subpar lab in China to do the same research, and that could have been, and many analysts are saying that probably was the source of the release. So, that's not to be taken up as an issue?
You mean to tell me that the same players that grew in disfavor in this country in that lab just transported themselves over to China and started working again?
Say
Is that what you're telling me?
I didn't know.
The same cast of characters was involved?
As what?
As if we shut down Wuhan in this country saying it was not safe and it went to China, are you telling me it's a whole new cast of characters in that Chinese lab, or are it the same ones?
The same ones as here?
The same people.
It was the same people. It was shut down in this country because of safety concerns. So Fauci's group is the one who funded the research in China. They transferred it to China. That's a fact.
Did they transfer all the personnel with it?
No, it's Chinese personnel. I mean, they were conferring with Fauci's team here. Whether they were physically there any amount of time, I don't know. But they were working together. Whether they were physically in China, I don't know. But they knew that lab was subpar in terms of containing spills, and yet they funded it.
Well, that may well be, but there's no evidence to suggest that no extra safeguards were taken when the lab moved from this country to China. You can't make that statement. You don't know that the same lax procedures were in place.
Okay, point well taken. We don't know. How come we don't know? Because there's been no investigation.
And there won't be, because it's in China.
This shows you how we kowtow to China, which is a danger to this country, where China is increasingly calling the shots, even on vital concerns such as a worldwide pandemic. How pathetic. And nobody's worried about this?
Well, I'm worried about it, but I just don't see that this lab, as sloppy as it was can be blamed for all the politics that's askew in this country, and that's what you're trying to do here.
No, what in terms of the politics being askew, more specifically, they're askew in terms of making deals with China, benefiting from them on an individual basis, and letting China do whatever the hell it wants. Yeah, that's what's askew in this country, and it's obvious.
Well, we had a conversation about China before, um, in terms of what it does and what it can get away with, because it knows it can get away with it anytime, any place, anywhere. Take the North Korean missile program. All of that comes from China. They didn't have one thing in Pyongyang that could have produced the kind of weaponry that we're seeing today. It all came from China.
Okay,
And no country in this world has protested that connection.
exactly. And is that not a problem?
Of course it's a problem.
And why
But
have
it's not just this country.
you could say, well, that's like saying, well, I might as well commit a murder because everybody else does. So that justifies it because everybody else is doing it. And everybody else is on board with making deals with China. And a lot of it is a personal benefit. I started saying Nancy Pelosi and her husband on the Democratic side of the aisle, they do better than Warren Buffett with their investments because she has the inside information. That's insider trading. For us, we'd be put in jail. For her, it's allowed. So she's making money, and a lot of those deals involve China. On the other side of the aisle, Mitch McConnell, with his Chinese wife, whose family has a big shipping company. So, he'll steer legislation that's beneficial to the family and his wife. So both sides of the aisle are raking in the money from China, and what they're doing is causing a deterioration of this country. It's going now to safety, to our national safety here.
Well, I don't disagree with that at all. I think China is going to be the biggest threat the United States has in the next 2 decades, and how we handle it is going to determine whether we survive as the thriving democracy that we once were.
And Brian, this is what I'm saying, especially now with the control of the media, one thing after another, people don't even know about it. A lot of people I talk to had no idea what the Hunter laptop story was, because unless you're watching Fox, which admittedly has an agenda, but at least they're getting the story out. Unless you're watching Fox or reading the New York Post, you wouldn't know that story existed, as many other stories. So they're controlling this information and keeping the public largely unaware of issues that directly affect them, freedom, democracy, and the future of this country economically and militarily.
Well, you know what? Fox still has the greatest audience of any of the cable network operations. So to say that the country is in the dark is a specious argument. They're not in the dark. They're being spoon-fed this night after night after night.
Brian, it's not a specious argument. I have a personal friend who was in the media who didn't know anything about the Hunter Biden story after it was out there for a year on Fox, because this person who had been in the media didn't watch Fox. He knew nothing about it.
Well, all I'm saying is that the people who do watch Fox knew all about it.
Yes,
and where were they at the polls?
But
where were they in their local newspapers?
But
where were they in their local TV stations?
But not, you can't get the story out with local media or national media unless it's through Fox or the New York Post or a few websites that haven't been shut down or controlled yet. They're controlling the narrative more. They're controlling information, and that's how a democracy cannot function. That's why the First Amendment was set up. Again, the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson among them, he was ticked off with the newspapers of the day because they used to attack him. He used to say they're full of lies. But yet he was pushing for the First Amendment because he knew, in balance, hopefully, one newspaper would be on one side, one newspaper on the other side. If you have free access to several sources, a number of sources, maybe you get the real information in between. That's why he pushed and others for the First Amendment. They were attacked in their day by newspapers.
Well, that's right. Newspapers were the only way to get the word across from people, except mouth to mouth. But I think Jefferson understood better than anybody that to put any bridle on free information was a mistake. Even though he disagreed with what was being said, he will defend to his death that person's right to say it.
Exactly.
And I think that we passed that mark a long time ago. You know, we passed it when we were in World War One, and we basically ignored what was going on in Europe until, you know, we had no choice but to enter the war. Some of the information about whether the U.S. actually knew about Pearl Harbor in advance is now being, you know, explored. So free information really took a back seat long before now.
So you don't think it's accelerating and intensifying? And
It might be, but I think the parameters are certainly bigger, but I don't think it's the first time we've engaged in this sort of stuff.
okay, so therefore we should just accept it. It's too far gone to correct or even criticize, even call
No,
it.
no. I'm not. Well, we're criticizing it now. So no. The answer to that is, it if you get howls from someone, that means you're usually pretty close to the bone in terms of the information you're putting out. When people squawk, that usually means you've got something going. Now, it may take longer with certain stories to get rolling, such as the Hunter Biden story, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen.
I think the next couple of years will decide what this country is going to become. And I think it's heading now towards a police state. We're halfway there already with the control not only of the media, but the agencies, the FBI, CIA was long, you know, their own domain, but the CIA, other agencies have all been politicized now, and they're becoming a political arm and enforcement arm of the Biden administration.
Well, what about Trump saying in the first debate that he was going to sic his attorney general on Hillary Clinton for the emails? Now, what kind of nonsense was that?
Why is it nonsense if there was something legitimate to investigate?
He didn't know crap about it at that point.
It was out there, Brian. I knew crap about it.
He knew nothing. He couldn't put two and two together and come up with four.
How come I knew about it? What was on there? What was potentially incriminating? How come I knew about it? Trump didn't know about it?
If he did, he was fed the information just as a talking point.
But look, again, don't forget, a lot of he was a newbie in Washington. He didn't know who the players were, who he could trust, who was really on his side. That's part of what made him not as effective as he could be. And he's the only guy so far, no matter what you think of him, that took on all points of the entrenched government. He's challenging everybody. That's why they're trying to destroy him. But we're getting off on the topic here. Again, you know, Musk, I see so far as one of the prime possibilities of saving free speech in this country, because nobody else is stepping up to do it. Not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, not the so-called vaunted investigative reporters. They're all on board now with the narrative. I mean, this is a disgusting and dangerous situation where the government seizes control of all information that we get. Where do we go from there?
Well, see, I'm not there with you on that. I think we're probably skipping in that direction. Is it reversible? Yes. But I don't want to see anybody's policeman, the First Amendment policeman, coming up and saying, you can't talk about this, you can't talk about that, you can't talk about me, you can't talk about my wife. I don't want to hear any of that crap.
That's exactly what they've been doing with Twitter and Facebook and even the networks. That's exactly what they've been doing.
I don't see that it's that far along. You do, I don't.
All Musk has done so far is open up Twitter and reestablishing people that were banned before. You know, they were banning even satire. One of my satires on Biden was banned on YouTube. So they've all been in on this, and it's controlling the narrative for a political party for their own benefit. And democracy cannot survive under those circumstances.
Well, I mean, is it just the Democrats that are doing this, or is it the
No,
Republicans too?
exactly. And I've already said that. Both parties are co-opted. Not everybody in both parties, but largely they all go along with it. And by the way, what brought about the rise of China? It was Joe Biden who led the charge to admit China into the World Trade Organization and bestow upon them most favored nation status. That is a fact. Look it up. Joe Biden. And now he was up until recently, he's been saying, well, there's nothing to worry about China. They're not going to eat our lunch. That's ridiculous. They're just a friendly competitor. They're not an enemy. Now he's starting to go a little bit the other direction because people are getting more and more alarmed about the power of China. Now he's giving lip service that, oh, we got to control it. But that's not what he said all along. And he enabled the rise of China through the World Trade Organization, which is not mentioned by the mainstream media, among many other things that would hurt Joe Biden.
Look, it wasn't just Biden. It was Apple. It was all these companies who had to make a big buck on the cheap Chinese labor. And Apple is still doing it. And if you think they're going to come and start making phones in this country just because we open up a semiconductor plant, you're crazy. That's not going to happen.
I agree, but who allowed the outsourcing of jobs and technology? Among the prominent pushers of this was Joe Biden.
Oh, and what about our friend from GE?
Jack Welch.
Jack Welch. What about him? What about the other people who farmed out all this stuff to the third world countries to save a buck, to sublimate unions? And that's all it was done for.
I agree.
And nobody squawked about that.
Well, they should have been. Both sides should have been squawking about it. But again, everybody was in on the deal. Politicians, their palms are being greased. A case in point with that is now FTX, the cryptocurrency, and Sam Bankman-Fried, the boy genius, the Warren Buffett of his generation. He's just a fraudster. And the way he was getting away, why was everybody looking the other way? Because their palms are being greased.
Of
Campaign
course.
contributions, mostly the Democrats, but also the Republicans, and to the regulators who are supposed to be keeping an eye on his operation. I mean, this is how corrupt the political system has become.
Yeah. I agree with that. I think that that new and better regulation is at hand, just like it was after the Great Recession of 2008. As we said before in this discourse we had, regulation does not grow out of somebody's cabal in the back room somewhere. It grows because there's been abuse. That's what spawns regulation. And
initially it does, but then it could also be used manipulatively for special interests.
Well, of course, but to not have any reaction is worse.
I agree. I mean, look, the rise of the unions is what curbed the corruption of the robber barons, detestable conditions.
Right.
I live near Scranton, the coal mines. You had 12-year-old kids working in the coal mines. The unions corrected that. But then, as happens, as power blocks evolve, some of the unions became too powerful and in themselves became corrupt. Teamsters Union, case in point. But, we don't have that balance anymore between the working class and the elites. It's the elites now that have been so integrated with the levers of government, the executive branch.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
No, I think there are plenty of people in this country who want the plebes and the patricians back in place again, and they're not gonna give up until they get there. Yeah. And the first attacks you see are on Social Security because they figure, well, this gives the middle class a way to live in dignity after they retire, and damn it, we're going to take that away from them and put them in the pigeonhole just the way they were in the early 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's a viable option anymore because even the Republican base now is largely working class, elderly, sometimes some middle class, where they wouldn't stand for that. So I mean,
well, the question is whether their leaders will sneak it by. That's what you got to watch out for. Not the Republican base. By the time they realize what's going on, it'll be law.
See, now that reinforces my point about the importance of a independent, objective media. These things go by the board increasingly because it's not being reported, because the government is controlling what's to be reported, what's to be hidden from the public. So all this stuff is occurring without the public even knowing about it. Again, which reinforces my point about what a danger it is with the media being controlled.
Now, here's a point you and I have talked about: entitlement programs.
Yeah.
Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Nonsense.
Right.
Social Security and Medicare are not entitlement programs. They are paid for. Every week somebody gets a paycheck. Medicaid is an entitlement program because that's health care for the poor provided directly by the government. So the Republicans' talking point years ago was lump all of these things together and we can stir up all kinds of opposition to the Social Security and Medicare benefit packages that are going to come before us in the Congress. Well, yours truly sent a letter to Jonathan Lemire, an email to him, maybe two or 3 years ago, the guy who was doing MSNBC early this morning. And at the time, he was an Associated Press reporter as well. He was doing two jobs. And I cautioned him against buying into the Republican line that Social Security and Medicare were entitlement programs, pointing out exactly what I said to you just now. All of a sudden, in the last 6 or 8 months, you're seeing some indication that only Medicaid is a written entitlement program and that Social Security and Medicare are indeed paid programs. My goodness, how long did it take to get that one going?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and the Democrats should have never accepted that nomenclature for it, but they did.
Of course.
And again, what does that show, Brian? It shows that, they're all in on it to one extent or another.
Well, I think in the case of Democrats, with not squawking about that, I don't think they ever thought it would get any traction. And the answer was after Newt Gingrich embraced it and came up with his storied line about I'm going to let Social Security hang out on the vine. Remember that one? Then it became obvious to the Democrats that there was an agenda here that they had not noticed.
Yeah, but I didn't hear Democrats then or now saying it is not an entitlement. Don't call it that.
Well, that's right. It went on too long. They should have been challenged much earlier. But it shows you that the political narrative can be changed. It'll be hard. It'll be difficult, but that doesn't mean it cannot be done.
Well, Brian, I hope you're right, but I fear that we may be at or approaching the point of no return, because so much now is being controlled. All the levers of government, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the Justice Department under Merrick Garland, it's selective prosecution of political enemies, and the control of the media overall. This attack on the First Amendment and that's been the safety valve, getting contrary information out since the country was founded. And that is being imperiled now. And without it, it's much easier and much quicker to get to a police state, which I fear we're heading to. The next couple of years are going to decide that. Brian Thomas, most likely with the AP News Bureau in Washington, D.C., and a longtime political observer and commentator. Thanks once again for being with us and for expressing your well-considered opinions. Thanks, Brian.
You bet.